pretty much ever since I was first introduced to the Mercedes SLR McLaren, it was almost immediately one of my favourite cars. It's a supercar which always appears somewhere in my favourites list, and of course, being a top 50, it's pretty much guaranteed a place. Now, it's pretty high on the list, in 17th, but it's justified. Totally justified in being that high for me, because it's just one of those supercars that always does it for me. I'm always happy to see it in a game, and it's always a strong one to go for. It's a great supercar, it's a great investment as well in the supercar world, because although, in a similar way, funnily enough, to the Carrera GT, which is one of its best rivals, they dropped in value for a little while, around, say, 2006 to 2008, but then the prices really started to pick up again, and now you're looking at easily 300 or 400 grand, if not even more, since the last time I checked. Now, the Porsche, I believe, is worth even more still, whereas the SLR, not quite as much. It hasn't increased by as drastic an amount, but still this is one of the most respected supercars of the earlier 2000s, and, although you may not realise it, it's one of the most prolific. Mercedes built around 1,000 SLR McLarens, and in the supercar world, of course, 1,000 is a lot. Even the Veyron had a production run of, 300 or so, so this absolutely eclipses that, and it's way beyond most of the other supercars on this list, many of which are one-offs or have an extremely limited production run. That's kind of a supercar thing. They don't usually make that many. But with Mercedes, they've got big backing, big development, and of course when you combine two companies like Mercedes and McLaren to make a supercar, expect it to be good. Now, this vehicle has a ton to work with. It's got this supercharged 5.4 litre V8, which sounds incredible. I'll always remember the first time I ever went to the Goodwood Festival of Speed. It was back in 2009. We went through the gate, got to the hill climb near the supercar paddock, and the very first vehicle I ever heard going up the hill was an SLR. As we walked through, I could hear this fighter plane-esque rumble of this Mercedes SLR flying up the hill, and it sounded absolutely incredible. It's easily one of my favourite supercar sounds, because in a similar way to, again, around the 5-litre Mustang engine, it just has this gorgeous rumble. It's surprisingly deep for an engine which isn't all that big. Now, of course, a 5.4 litre isn't small, but it's nothing like the 7 litre or 7.3 of a Zonda or the 7.5 litre Cadillac Cian or the 8 litre Viper or Veyron, and yet it sounds just as big as those. Now, being supercharged, you're looking at over 600 horsepower. Of course, the 722 is even more powerful. I also, in that same year at Goodwood, saw the ultra rare 722S edition, which is a Roadster in bright orange, which looks incredible. This one, though, is my favourite version. It's the normal SLR, but the open-top version. Now, I do also love the 722 and the 722 Roadster, but to me, as I've said before in the series, I often prefer a vehicle of a given lineup. Not just among my favourites, but in general also in its purest form. And to me, although you could say that the coupe is the purest form, apart from the fact that it's a ragtop, this is the pure SLR design. It doesn't have the carbon fibre in the headlights, it doesn't have the chin splitter, various other things, little updates that the 722 has, plus I'm a sucker for the turbine wheels. I think they look absolutely fantastic. I love the fact that it has the push-button start in the gear stick. The gull-wing doors look fantastic. They're some of my favourite examples of gull-wing doors. And the car just has such a presence to it. It's an elegant supercar. I would personally have it probably if I was going to own one, which is never going to happen, of course, but if I could, maybe in blue. A dark blue, possibly black, but I like dark blue because it's not an obvious choice, but unlike black, it allows you to see the contours and details of the car, whereas with black, it's a little bit too dark to be able to see everything, and silver is just too generic for a Mercedes, whereas dark blue, it's not as expected. Maybe dark blue with a red interior, perhaps brown. I think that those kind of high contrast colours often look very good on a supercar. If you think of the chartreuse colour on the SLS electric drive, or the white and blue on an MC12, or the orange and carbon on a Zonda F, or even the orange and carbon on a Veyron Supersport, they really stand out. Now for me, the SLR is one of those cars which would definitely be in my dream lineup. I wouldn't necessarily choose it over everything else as a supercar of choice, of course, that's why it's not in the top 10 for instance, but this is a stalwart for me. It's a supercar that I've always loved, it never lets me down in any game, it's always a great choice to go for, and although by today's standards 208 miles per hour, 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds may not sound like the best thing ever, this comes from a different era. Even though 2004, 2005 doesn't sound like a long time ago, it really is these days. That's like 14 or 15 years ago now. It's funny to think that this car is 14 or 15 years old, and yet it is. It's aged so well, just like many of the supercars of the early 2000s have, but this one is more prolific. I would say it's a lot more elegant than something like a Carrera GT, which is much more of a hardcore, aggressive, Zonda-style supercar. This one is pure presence and class and luxury. And to be honest, the only slight downside to the SLR for me is the interior. The interiors of cars is something that I've talked about before in this list, and will probably touch on again, but for this car, for me, it's just a little bit too understated. Given the price of the car, the performance, even the visuals from the outside, it's a striking looking car, but from the inside, I don't know, the interior just looks a little bit too normal for me, like the kind of interior that you'd expect more from an SL or an SLS rather than something like a McLaren. And I just wish they'd gone maybe a little bit more outside the box, like the CLK GTR did, for instance. But it's not much of a downside, I still love the interior, and I love the car overall. Certainly worthy of a place in my top 20, most definitely, and it's one of the most recurring cars in all of my favourites lists. But that's it for this installment. Of course, you can check out all of the other picks by clicking through at the end, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.